Before we go into a Q&A, let me just say two things, kind of a postscript to what I mentioned here. One is, I think we have to be, in light of Michael Bird and N.T. Wright's new book there, I think there's something about that in particular that I think is really important as we think about pastoring people, is recognizing the presence of powers and principalities. This is Ephesians 6. The way I think about powers and principalities is this way. I think powers and principalities are nefarious forces that get connected to individuals, ideologies, and institutions, with the goal being threefold: deception, division, depersonalization. And so social media is a power and principality. Cable news is a power and principality. As I come from a Pentecostal tradition where powers and principalities are usually restricted to individuals who might be demonized or needing deliverance or something along those lines. And surely people still need to be delivered from those powers there. In this context here, I want to talk about it much larger here. So being on guard of the ways that whenever you're talking about power structures, symbols of power, you're now entering into powers and principalities territory, which is why my wife and I, Rosie, every month we have a finance meeting, and we sit down for about an hour to talk about our home finances. And do you know that's the most difficult meeting of the month for us? Because Jesus says that money is not simply a neutral tool, but a rival God. It's a power and a principality. This is Matthew 6. And so whenever we're talking about it, we're 3 minutes into our conversation talking about our budget when we're at each other's throats. And so we've had to go back and say, honey, before we even talk about money, let's pray that you're not the enemy. I'm not the enemy. Satan would like to make you the enemy and make me the enemy. So let's pray. And I think we have to, in this election season, we need to start talking like that in our churches. You're not the enemy. I'm not the enemy. There's a larger power at work here that's seeking to deceive, depersonalize. What I mean by depersonalization is you're not seeing the full humanity of the people before you. You are relegating them to the thing that they believe in that you hate the most. And so you're not seeing the full story, which ultimately leads to division. The second thing I'll just say around this, and then happy to get some questions going, is I think as pastors, there's 3 questions, and the last 2 are actually really connected, but 3 questions that we have to wrestle with as we're thinking about managing our own presence, anxiety, and such. The first is this: who makes you most anxious and why? In your church community, who makes you most anxious and why? I think being able to name people's names and say, why does this person in particular make me most anxious? Another question is, who are you trying to curry the favor of? Another way of saying on the flip side is, who are you trying to avoid? Whose displeasure are you trying to avoid? And along those lines, do you know that a church could be 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 large and be controlled by one person? The person you're trying to avoid the displeasure of, the person you're trying to curry favor of, which is why I'll just read this one quote here from Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman wrote a book on meditations, and one of the meditations was on courage and cowardice, how to delineate courage from cowardice. And this is what he says, and then we'll take some questions. He says, there is ever a thin line which separates courage from cowardice. Sometimes the distinction between courage and cowardice is not easy to make. Then he gives an example. Here is a man who seems always to manifest bravery. Even before the issues are clearly defined, he takes his stand, lest he be regarded by himself or others as being a coward. Or it may be that he moves into a situation with utter recklessness, unmindful of any clear estimate of what is involved, lest his deliberations might be construed as a fearful hesitance. As a boy, he was ever the one to take a dare because he did not want to seem chicken. He is always first to sense a moment when an issue seems to be sidestepped and is ever eager to grasp the nettle while others wait for reinforcement. He enjoys the reputation of being forthright, direct, and unafraid. This estimate of this fellow may be well deserved, but it may not be, for his seeming courage may be but his defense against a deep inner uncertainty and creeping fear. And what Thurman is naming there is something really important that people would often say to me, Rich, you're so courageous. You say something, and I know deep down in my heart that there's certain things I say because I don't want to risk the displeasure of this person in my church. And so here's the question. To what degree are my words rooted in the presence of Jesus and what Jesus is inviting me to share in that moment? And to what degree is it being shaped by the people I'm trying to avoid the displeasure or curry the favor of? And so I think that's some of the work we have to do as pastors and leaders. Okay, the floor is open.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on preparing your staff team, lay leaders, also to shepherd alongside you, just a congregation overall. Yeah.
Yeah, when I think about pastoring and creating a culture that's able to navigate some of the big issues well, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about sexuality, whether we're talking about politics, I do think that the time to start is always right now. From a race perspective, it's amazing how many people emailed me after George Floyd was murdered and with what do you do next? And I'm thinking, this actually should have been part of your discipleship strategy in 2015. And so I think right now is a great time to start building in. So very practically, I think what this looks like is I like to think in concentric circles around who are the groups of people within the community I pastor that I need to spend time with to slowly and prayerfully work through some of these issues. Last year, I led a 10-week series on human sexuality where we were addressing the gamut of sexuality and questions around that. What people saw is a sermon series, but what they didn't see was a year and a half before that, I was spending time with our elders, my first circle, our pastoral team, our larger staff team, our leadership community, and then the church. And so for a year and a half, there was lots of preparation. I did that because I failed in the past trying to preach on stuff that I hadn't processed with my team first. And then all of a sudden, people, my elders and leaders like, what is he saying up there? We have never talked about that. And so by the time I even preached on sexuality, I knew I had all of my elders, not necessarily that everyone agreed with me 100%, but they knew my heart. They were with me. There was no surprise. Something along these lines as well. I think, what would it look like to create space within whatever leadership structure you are pastoring and overseeing to have unhurried conversation around this? What are the points of anxiety? What are the points of clarity that's required? What are we doing right now that we need to change? So I think thinking along those lines, this is a spiritual formation thing, and I think this is increasingly becoming that, but it's a perennial issue. In the same way that racism is a perennial issue in our country, in the same way that matters regarding sexuality is a perennial issue. In other words, we can't get away from it. The same things applied to politics. And so I think creating a space to address those communities, I think, is within our churches are really important. Thank you. Others?
Hello, how's it going? So I have a question. I know that this whole thing was basically talking about, politics amongst the church, right? Amongst our fellowship or leadership. What is your stand on Okay, so like supporting the actual government, as far as Christians go, like how do you? I know that we're like responsible for our church. That's like the first priority. But as far as like pushing for changes and stuff like that within legislation and stuff like that, what is your stance and how do we as Christians kind of like take a stand if we want to go that route?
Yeah. Um, so again, when I talk about the 6 levels of engagement, I think that political part I think is really important. Um, when I think about the civil rights movement and the ways that Dr. King was not saying, "Hey, we're just going to pray our way out of this situation," but we're actually going to work to see things legislated politically. Now, I think there's absolutely space for that and time for that. I think to what degree, the larger questions I think are theological and formational in nature that inform that. For example, I think so much of my own angst around political engagement is often rooted in so much of the legislation is not rooted in Christian love and spirituality, but it's another way of just power plays. And so I have a hermeneutic of suspicion around so much of what is going on politically in terms of our engagement in the world, which is why I think this all starts with our own self-examination. I think it starts with to what degree are the words of Jesus shaping the way we are to show up in the world. And then I recognize that there's this, I have yet to hear, if some of you have heard, if anyone has heard this, please send me the link. I have yet to hear a really compelling message, and I'm not saying that just because I haven't heard it is not out there, on the conscience. And the ways that we are to make space for our conscience in larger socio-political settings. I think there's not enough formation around the conscience. And so to what degree are we being informed by Jesus? To what degree are we following our conscience? To what degree is the way we're working to see particular policies enacted not just reflective of the gospel of Jesus, but even the way we're doing it? To what degree is that reflecting Jesus? And so I'm fine for engagement. There are people within our community that are political activists. There are people within our community that part are folks who offer legislative leadership and governmental leadership within our own community in Borough and Queens. And so I think that's good work as well. I think it's holy work as well if it's in service of one's neighbor and the common good. But I would say the very simple answer is discerningly engaging that. H. Richard Niebuhr wrote a book called Christ and Culture. It's a seminal book of the 20th century. And he listed out all these different postures of Christ related to culture, which is really appropriate to church as well. Christ against culture, Christ above culture, Christ and culture in conflict, and all the Christ the transformer of culture. I think a book like that, if you want to add to your resources, as well as Andy Crouch's Culture Making, I think could be a really helpful resource as we think about what it means to be engaged in the world. But I think that's holy work as well, when it's in service and informed by the way of Jesus and in love for neighbor. Any others? There, then there. How much time, Eric? So 10 minutes, okay.
I just wanted to just hear your thoughts on how our current political climate is driving this Christian nationalism, and how do we unpack that and help people get to a place where their hope is not in a creative history of who we are, but really in Christ and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, plenty of tremendous new books on Christian nationalism. As a pastor, what I would say is the vast majority of work that needs to be done is emotional. Back to the powers and principalities, so much of the narrative around why we need Christ in schools and, the whole Ten Commandments thing, when people forget, it's amazing, when prayer was in school, there were some big problems going on in our country here. And so I think so much of it is motivated by fear and anxiety, particularly fear of the other. So much of the work that I think, and I think there's some really good theological and historical treatments of Christian nationalism, and all these new books that are emerging, I think, are really helpful along those lines. As a pastor, I recognize that my primary job is to help people name their fears with specificity. Not that that's the only thing that needs to be done, but I'm talking to pastors in here. Helping people to name their fears, particularly of the other, whoever that other might be, I think is the primary task of pastoring. And submitting those fears unto Jesus. It's, if perfect love casts out fear, then perfect fear casts out love. And I think we have to help people recognize the fear and the stories behind those fears. Who's shaping these stories? Who's telling you these stories? I think that's one of the primary tasks of pastoring. On this side, yeah.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
I think they want to capture it for the video, though, there as well.
For the video.
Although the audio there, yeah.
Okay. How do we navigate politicians that come to our churches that depersonalize us solely for votes?
Don't bring them to your churches. I mean, just And
I raise that question in how you've invited us to say, don't depersonalize the people that come to you, see them as full human beings.
Yes.
But what would you suggest the church's responsibility is, for all intents and purposes, to prep a politician before coming to say, do you see us as human, right? You want to come for the votes, things of that nature. So can you speak to that, please?
I recognize that various traditions make space for that moment in the life of a worship service. This is not this. If I can use kind of Pauline language of like, this is me. This is not the Lord. I just want to make sure when Paul's writing. I think to have politicians come during a worship gathering. Eric, I want to be invited back here. I don't want to say this. I'm going to say. I mean, I'll use a fancy word, okay? I think as an abdication of spiritual leadership. That's the nice way of saying it. I think here's what I do know as well, though. I know that historically, within particular communities that have been marginalized, that have been socially relegated to the margins, that to talk about spirituality is to talk about politics in terms of how the world is arranged, especially for those who are on the underside of history, the oppressed. And so I recognize the tension that exists therein. And so if I know that a pastor is bringing in someone who believes that whatever social policies they are presenting is actually going to be for the good of a particular community that might be on the margins of society, I think we could steward that space with wisdom. But when it's not in the service of the poor and the marginalized, I have a hard time making space. Now, at New Life, we've never invited, and we won't invite anyone politically to step on the pulpit before my sermon or whatever it is and say, hey, I'm looking to do all this stuff there. If we wanted to create a separate environment for that, a town hall space for civic engagement, that's different. But I do think on a Sunday morning, I would not recommend it. And at the same time, no shade against folks that are doing that, but if it's in service of the poor and the marginalized, then I can make some space for that. But it's something that typically, in principle, wouldn't advise. Right here, and then maybe one more.
Hi. How do you discern there's so many issues right now that people are talking about. How do you discern which of those issues you're going to talk about from the pulpit? And then I guess connected to that, how do you discern, especially at a church like yours, a church like ours in LA, where it is so divisive, and the same issue or the same ruling that might half of the church would be celebrating it, the other half of the church will be grieving it.
Yes.
How do you discern how you're going to address it on a Sunday morning?
Yeah, very painfully. I think on one level, I do have a sense as to like some of the large themes that are shaping the community I live. I pastor and live with. 2/3, half of Queens is foreign born, and so for example, immigration, like that's a big deal for our context here. And so I would like to think that some of the things that I will be addressing emerge from me being on the ground with the particular group of people that God has entrusted to me. And so I'm looking, I'm trying to address incarnationally within my own context. What do I sense are the points of pain, the points that need specific addressing? So it's emerging, I think, out of hopefully a pastoral awareness of what's happening. To the second piece there, I think that's kind of the nature of diversity, which makes it very painful. Without being too dramatic, whoever gets voted in, like, it's going to be problems everywhere. And I would, a good portion of my church, the Sunday after the election, are going to be rejoicing. And then there's going to be some that are going to be weeping. And I think just anticipating that, I think there's a way to meet people in there. At New Life, I gave a sermon before the election. And it was a sermon that was oriented around whoever wins, this is the truth for whoever wins. And it was around like making space for grief and watching the ways that you are rejoicing in such a way now that is kind of like it's no longer an act of love. It's an act of now, I'm marginalizing you right now because of this here. And so I don't know if there's an easy way around that except to help people recognize the vast diversity that exists within this community. And what does it look like for us to be the presence of love for one another and curiosity for one another? But it's very difficult, and I don't think there's an easy answer around that. How about one more, and then it's all yours, Eric.
So our church a while ago had done a lot of work around racial reconciliation with like very specific groups that we're committed to. But I'm wondering if your church has done anything specific in political reconciliation, or like if you guys, so you've had sermons, you're describing those things. Were there like other ways that you followed up on that to kind of help each other navigate that or have the conversations or dialogue? So I'm wondering how that might have looked.
Yeah. Much of what we've done in the past few years has had three elements to it. So whether it's what's being proclaimed on Sunday morning, which often then has this small group element of discussion and leadership within our small groups. We're a congregation that is oriented around tables and meet people, 60 to 70 groups that are meeting around the city. And so structuring those spaces well for those ongoing conversations have been important. And then a third kind of equipping space. So we've had seasons of that where we've addressed it, particularly in moments like we're in right now, of whether we're inviting a guest. So yes, it's been part of our formational strategy in terms of how do we do this. But at this stage, it hasn't. There's not like a course that we're doing right now that we're helping people to engage in. I think the work that Michael Ware is doing, I think the work that some of the folks that are coming here, these are folks that's their particular area of specialty, that I hope content emerges from that and curriculum emerges around that. But at this time, I think we're just addressing it on a very seasonal level, as needed. I'll say one more thing, and he'll probably be embarrassed I said this here, but my own soul has been really, as a pastor, to really navigate through these moments. I think you need a lot of help along the way. And I've needed at least 4 different kinds of people around me to help tend to my soul as a pastor. I've needed a small group of guys that I've met with for the last 7 years, once a month. I've needed a therapist who I have seasonal therapy with. So I don't have therapy every week or every month, but I have seasons of therapy when I found myself stuck, especially. My predecessor has been a really important person in terms of he knows what it's like to be in this role. And I've needed a leadership coach as well. And I've met with a leadership coach for the last probably 12 years every month. And he's one of your own in terms of, and he's in the room in the back there, a guy named Buck Rogers. Buck didn't pay me to do this. He didn't ask me to do this here, but Buck's in the back there. I do, from a place called Rancho Cucamonga. What a place. What a name. And I thought it was a cartoon at first. I was just like, no, that's actually a little place there. And Buck has been one of my dearest friends and a ministry coach to me over the last 12 years. And I think you all need someone like Buck who's going to help you think big picture. And Eric mentioned his name as well earlier today in terms of, so I think the big picture is we all need lots of help around us. You can't do it alone, which is why I'm so glad for this community here. If left to my own devices, the church would have burned down already. And I'm so glad to have the help around me. So, Eric.